The last thing she touched before she died was a first edition Charles Dickens, and someone made sure she never finished the chapter. Agnes Whitmore was 63, a small-town librarian who alphabetized her spices and baked lemon pies for neighbors every Tuesday. On a snowy night in February 2023, she was found suffocated in her own rare books room, and the only clue was a misplaced bookmark with GPS coordinates. Coordinates that pointed somewhere no one could explain until it was too late. The book that killed her was worth more than her house. Agnes Whitmore was the kind of woman you imagined when you thought about a small-town librarian. 63 years old, soft-spoken, always in pressed cardigans that smelled faintly of cinnamon, and unfailingly polite. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed when you were low on milk before you did, who brought soup to your doorstep before you realized you were coming down with something. Her life in Fairford, Vermont, population just over 3,200, was a simple, structured rhythm. She'd been a librarian for more than 35 years, the last 20 spent in the Fairford Public Library's crown jewel, the rare books room. A locked, glass-walled chamber filled with first editions and delicate manuscripts, many older than the town itself. Agnes's habits bordered on ritual. She alphabetized everything, the spices in her kitchen, the rows of jams in her pantry, even the tea tins lined on her shelf. Neighbors joked that if you moved a jar out of order, she'd know instantly. She kept a leather-bound journal, worn soft with age, in which she'd recorded every single book she'd read since 1979. Every Tuesday, no matter the weather, Agnes baked lemon pies for her neighbors. Not just one or two. She made 6, sometimes 8, carefully boxed and delivered in her little silver hatchback. She'd chat for a few minutes at each stop, then head home before dusk. People in Fairford had grown to expect the knock at their door on Tuesday afternoons. She lived alone in a modest white house on Pine Street. No deadbolts, no alarm system. In Fairford, you didn't need those things. Or at least, Agnes believed you didn't. Her desk at the library always had a chipped teacup on it. It had belonged to her late husband, Samuel. He'd been gone 15 years now, but she never stopped using it. Some patrons thought it was odd, drinking tea out of something that couldn't sit flat without wobbling, but Agnes would smile and say, "It's my favorite because it's imperfect." Wednesday, February 8, 2023, began like most winter days in Fairford, cold enough to bite, with a snowstorm brewing on the horizon. By mid-afternoon, heavy flakes had begun falling, sticking to the roads. Most people left work early, heading home to beat the worst of it. Not Agnes. She stayed. The rare books room had received a donation from a Boston estate the previous week, a pristine first edition of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Agnes wanted to finish cataloging it before the storm got bad. The library was nearly empty by 6 p.m. The young assistant librarian, Carla Green, said goodnight and left, leaving Ags alone. At 9:47 p.m., the library's security system recorded a late night login under Agnes's username. This wasn't unusual. She often worked late, but given the snowstorm, it meant someone was inside the locked building with her at that time. At 10:15 p.m., a Fairford University sophomore named Caleb Brooks swore he saw Agnes leaving the library. He described her walking quickly, scarf trailing behind her in the wind. It was a detail he'd repeat over and over to police in the days ahead. But there was something else. No one paid much attention to that night. When the first edition Dickens was later recovered from the crime scene, a handmade bookmark was found inside. Not a store bought one, but a narrow strip of old map paper, frayed at the edges. The next morning, February 9th, Carla Green arrived early, bundled against the snow. She pushed open the rare books room door and froze. Agnes was slumped forward over the reading table, her face pressed into the open Dickens. At first, Carla thought she had fainted, maybe hit her head. She rushed forward, calling her name. It was the coldness of Agnes' hand that made her realize the truth. The crime scene photos are as haunting as they are bizarre. The heavy book lay open across her face. The crinkled pages bent and darkened where her breath had dampened them in her final moments. Cause of death: suffocation. Investigators determined that the book had been held firmly against her face until she could no longer breathe. The pressure left faint indentations in her skin, and ink had transferred from the page to her cheek. Detective Henry Mallory was the lead investigator. His first theory was theft, that someone had come for the Dickens and killed Agnes when she caught them. But the book was still there. Nothing else in the room appeared disturbed. Well, almost nothing. The chipped teacup Agnes always kept on her desk. It was gone. No one thought to mention it at first. Mallory told reporters, "Why assumed it was a robbery? We were wrong." From the beginning, the investigation moved in a narrow tunnel. Detective Mallory's team zeroed in on the theory of a rare book theft gone wrong. In their minds, someone had entered the rare book's room to steal the Dickens, been interrupted by Agnes, and killed her before fleeing. But for reasons they couldn't explain, they'd left the book behind. It was a neat story, but it didn't fit. For one thing, there were no signs of forced entry into the library. The doors had been locked from the inside. For another, the library's secondary server, the one that recorded backup logins, page accesses, and door swipes, hadn't been checked in the first 48 hours. That oversight would prove costly. When a junior IT tech finally pulled those logs a week later, he found that Agnes's account had been accessed twice that night, once at 9:47 p.m. and again at 10:09 p.m. The second login came after Caleb Brooks claimed she'd already left the building. Then there was the bookmark. On first glance, it was just a piece of an old map, something a history buff might use without a second thought. But when a lab technician examined it under magnification, faint pencil markings emerged, a set of GPS coordinates. Mallory's team treated it as a curiosity, not a lead. They didn't send anyone to the location until nearly 3 weeks later. When they did, the coordinates led to something unexpected, an overgrown property at the edge of town, long abandoned, and once the childhood home of Detective Mallory himself. When pressed, Mallory told reporters it was a coincidence. "You think every strange thing is a clue, until you've been doing this 20 years, he said. But inside the department, whispers began. Why would the killer leave coordinates pointing to the lead detective's old home? Was it a taunt? A red herring? Or something more direct? An attempt to connect him personally to the crime? Caleb Brooks's story had been straightforward. He'd seen Agnes leave the library around 10:15 p.m., walking quickly through the snow. But digital evidence had a way of undermining words. When detectives pulled Caleb's phone data, they discovered that at 10:12 p.m., his GPS location wasn't outside the library at all. It was inside, within a few meters of the rare book's room. When confronted, Caleb's composure faltered. He admitted he'd been inside, but claimed it was at Agnes's invitation. "She told me she had something to show me in the Dickens," he said. This raised new questions. What did she want to show him? And why would she trust a 20-year-old student with a rare, valuable book? Then came the kicker. Caleb's smartwatch logs showed his heart rate spiking to 145 beats per minute for a sustained 6-minute period starting at, you guessed it, 10:13 p.m. That was the exact minute the library's security cameras glitched, producing 10 seconds of corrupted video. And in those corrupted frames, barely visible, was a reflection in the glass cabinet near the reading table, the chipped teacup. But in the frame, the teacup wasn't on Agnes's desk. It was sitting on a lower shelf in the locked cabinet, as though someone had moved it, proof that the teacup existed after Agnes was supposedly dead. But the image was never released to the public. When police pressed Caleb further, he became defensive, then silent. He lawyered up the next day. The coordinates from the bookmark eventually led investigators to an abandoned farmhouse 8 miles outside town. It stood alone, sagging under decades of neglect, windows clouded with dust. Inside, under a tarp in the corner, they found boxes of old library artifacts, checkout cards, faded photographs, brittle newspapers. Among them was a chipped teacup. Not the one from Agnes's desk, but a near-identical twin. Detective Mallory finally admitted the connection. The farmhouse had been his father's property until 1981, and his father, Harold Mallory, had been quietly questioned in connection with the 1974 disappearance of a librarian named Mabel Hensley. She'd vanished from another Vermont library under circumstances hauntingly similar to Agnes's death. No forced entry, no sign of robbery, a missing personal belonging. Harold Mallory had never been charged, and the case went cold. When word of this reached the public, trust in the investigation collapsed. People began coming forward with things they'd previously kept to themselves. Like Agnes's neighbor, who recalled seeing her in a heated argument with Detective Mallory 2 weeks before her death. Or the retired janitor, who claimed he'd once seen Caleb leaving the rare books room with Mallory's niece after hours. The web tightened. Was Caleb working with Mallory? Or was someone trying to make it look that way? The coordinates from the Bookmark eventually led investigators to an abandoned farmhouse 8 miles outside town. It stood alone, sagging under decades of neglect, windows clouded with dust. Inside, under a tarp in the corner, they found boxes of old library artifacts, checkout cards, faded photographs, brittle newspapers. Among them was a chipped teacup. Not the one from Agnes's desk, but a near-identical twin. Detective Mallory finally admitted the connection. The farmhouse had been his father's property until 1981, and his father, Harold Mallory, had been quietly questioned in connection with the 1974 disappearance of a librarian named Mabel Hensley. She'd vanished from another Vermont library under circumstances hauntingly similar to Agnes's death. No forced entry, no sign of robbery, a missing personal belonging. Harold Mallory had never been charged, and the case went cold. When word of this reached the public, trust in the investigation collapsed. People began coming forward with things they'd previously kept to themselves. Like Agnes's neighbor, who recalled seeing her in a heated argument with Detective Mallory 2 weeks before her death. Or the retired janitor, who claimed he'd once seen Caleb leaving the rare books room with Mallory's niece after hours. The web tightened. Was Caleb working with Mallory? Or was someone trying to make it look that way? Today, the rare books room stays locked. The chipped teacup sits on a shelf, never touched, a quiet reminder of the questions no one in this town will answer. The coordinates on that bookmark, they still point to a place you can find on any map, but no one's gone back there in months. Some say they don't need to. Others say they're afraid of what they might find if they did. The full interrogation tapes drop next Tuesday. Hit notify, and tell me in the comments. What do you think Agnes saw in her final minutes?